The auction block. They were selling children in Red Hollow that day, right there on the platform where they usually auctioned cattle and mining equipment. Lena stood on splintered wood under a sun that showed no mercy, 8 years old and holding her sister so tight, her arms ached. Mara was 3. Too young to understand the hands reaching, the voices bidding, the way men looked at them like they were deciding between 2 horses. When the auctioneer said someone wanted only the older girl, Lena's voice cracked through the heat. "Don't take her. She's only 3. The crowd laughed. Then someone paid for them both. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. Now let me tell you what happened next. The morning had started in a church basement that smelled like mildew and boiled cabbage. Lena had woken to find Mara curled against her side, thumb in her mouth, the threadbare blanket they shared pulled up to her chin. Through the narrow window near the ceiling, she could see boots passing on the street above, miners heading to work, women carrying baskets, the everyday rhythm of a town that had no use for 2 orphaned girls. Mrs. Pritchard came down the stairs with heavy steps, her keys jangling at her belt. She was the kind of woman whose mouth turned down even when she wasn't frowning, whose hands were always cold when they grabbed you. "Up," she said, not looking at either of them. "Get yourselves decent. You're going to auction today." Lena didn't ask what that meant. She'd learned months ago that questions only brought sharper answers. She helped Mara out of bed, smoothed down the little girl's hair with spit and fingers, and buttoned the coat that was 2 sizes too big. Mara's eyes were still soft with sleep, trusting in the way only small children could be. "Where are we going, Lena?" Her voice was a whisper, uncertain. "Just a walk," Lena lied. "Stay close to me." They were given no breakfast. Mrs. Pritchard marched them up the stairs and out into a June morning that was already hot enough to shimmer. Red Hollow was a mining town carved into the Montana territory with all the grace of an axe wound, buildings thrown up fast, streets that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't, and a population that changed with every new strike or played out claim. People came here to get rich or get lost, sometimes both. The auction platform stood in the center of town, a raised wooden structure with steps on one side and a podium on the other. Lena had seen it used before. Furniture from abandoned claims, tools, once a whole wagon load of confiscated whiskey. She had never seen children sold there. But as Mrs. Pritchard led them closer, she saw 2 boys already standing on the platform, maybe 10 and 12, skinny and silent. A man in a brown suit was talking to a rancher, gesturing at the boys like he was describing workhorses. Lena's stomach turned to stone. "Up you go." Mrs. Pritchard's hand was firm on Lena's shoulder, pushing her toward the steps. Mara held tight to Lena's hand, her small fingers sweaty and trembling. The platform was worse than Lena had imagined. The sun beat down without shade, and the wood burned through the thin soles of her shoes. Below them, a crowd was gathering, men mostly, a few women, all of them looking up with expressions that ranged from curiosity to calculation. She recognized some faces from church, from the general store, from the street she walked when Mrs. Pritchard sent her on errands. None of them met her eyes now. The auctioneer was a thin man with a voice that carried like a preacher's. He stepped up to the podium, consulted a piece of paper, and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've got 4 wards of the county today, available for indenture or adoption. Good workers, all of them. Let's start with the boys." Lena stopped listening. She pulled Mara close, wrapping both arms around her sister's shoulders. Mara was shaking now, her face pressed into Lena's side. "I don't like this," she whispered. I know. Just hold on to me." The boys went fast. A mine foreman took both of them, paid without haggling, and led them away before Lena could see if they were brothers or just unlucky in the same way. Then the auctioneer's gaze fell on her and Mara. "Next we have 2 girls, sisters. The older one's 8, healthy, good for housework or minding younger children. The little one's 3, bit young for hard labor, but she'll grow into it." Lena felt the weight of dozens of eyes. She lifted her chin and stared straight ahead, trying not to see the way some of the men leaned in to get a better look, the way the women whispered behind gloved hands. Mara whimpered, and Lena tightened her grip. "Let's start the bidding at $10 for the pair." A hand went up, then another. The auctioneer's voice rose and fell in a rhythm that turned her and Mara into numbers, into commodities. $15, 18, 20. Then a woman's voice cut through, sharp and clear. I'll take the older girl, just her, $25. Lena's heart stopped. She turned and saw Mrs. Harlan, the dressmaker's wife, a pinch-faced woman who already had 3 daughters and was known for working them from dawn to dusk in the shop. The auctioneer looked uncertain. Ma'am, they're sisters. Selling them together would be, I don't need 2, just the one. She's big enough to be useful. The crowd murmured. Lena felt Mara's grip tighten so hard it hurt. She looked down and saw terror in her sister's eyes, the kind of fear that children shouldn't have to know. Something broke open in Lena's chest, something that had been holding back a flood of rage and desperation since the day their mother died and they were brought to Mrs. Pritchard's basement. Don't take her! Lena's voice was louder than she'd expected, carrying across the platform and into the crowd. She's only 3. She needs me. The auctioneer blinked, startled. Mrs. Harlan's face flushed red. That child doesn't get to make demands, she snapped. She's county property until someone pays for her. She's 3, Lena repeated, louder now, her voice shaking but refusing to break. You can't separate us. She's too little. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. A man near the front muttered something about decency, but Mrs. Harlan stepped closer to the platform, her expression cold. I've made my offer. Either accept it or find someone willing to pay for both. The auctioneer hesitated, looking between Lena and the woman. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of Mara's quiet sobbing against Lena's dress. Lena felt the platform tilt beneath her, felt the world narrowing to this single moment where everything could be taken away. Then a voice spoke from the back of the crowd, low and steady. I'll take them both. Every head turned. Lena looked up, squinting against the sun, and saw a man stepping forward through the crowd. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in worn work clothes and a hat that shadowed his face. He moved with the kind of quiet purpose that made people step aside without thinking. When he reached the edge of the platform, he stopped and looked up at the auctioneer. How much for both girls? The auctioneer seemed to recover himself. Well, sir, the bidding's at $25 for one. So, for both, I'd say $50. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He counted out coins onto the edge of the platform with a soft clink of silver. Cash. Right now. Mrs. Harlan sputtered in protest, but the auctioneer was already nodding, already reaching for the money. Sold. To Mr. Holt. Girls are yours, sir. The man, Holt, didn't wait for paperwork or ceremony. He climbed the steps to the platform with 3 long strides, and Lena saw his face clearly for the first time. He was maybe 35, weathered by sun and work, with gray eyes that held no particular warmth but no cruelty either. He looked at her and Mara the way someone might look at a problem that needed solving, direct, assessing, but not unkind. Come on, he said quietly. He bent down and lifted Mara into his arms before Lena could react. Mara stiffened, her eyes wide with fresh fear, but the man held her gently, supporting her weight like she was fragile. He glanced at Lena. You can walk, or I can carry you too. Either way, we're leaving. Lena found her voice, small and uncertain. Where are you taking us? My ranch. It's about an hour's ride north. He started down the steps, still holding Mara. You coming? Lena looked back at the crowd, at Mrs. Pritchard's disapproving frown, at Mrs. Harlan's red-faced fury, at all the faces that had watched them be sold like livestock. Then she looked at this stranger who had paid $50 without blinking, who held her sister like she mattered. She followed him down the steps. He had a wagon waiting at the edge of the square, a sturdy flatbed with 2 horses hitched to the front. He set Mara down on the bench seat and then turned to help Lena up. His hand was rough with calluses, but steady. Once they were both settled, he climbed up beside them, took the reins, and clicked his tongue. The horses started forward without fuss. They rode out of Red Hollow in silence. Lena kept one arm around Mara, who was still trembling, her face buried against Lena's shoulder. The man, Holt, didn't speak. He just drove, his attention on the road ahead, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. The town fell away behind them, replaced by open country. Rolling hills covered in dry grass, clusters of pine and juniper, distant mountains that looked blue in the haze. The sun climbed higher, and the heat pressed down like a physical weight. Lena's mouth was dry, but she didn't ask for water. She didn't ask for anything. She just held Mara and tried to think past the fear. After maybe 30 minutes, Mara whispered, "Lena, I'm scared." "I know, me too." The man glanced at them, just a flicker of his eyes. Then he reached behind the seat and pulled out a canteen. He handed it to Lena without a word. She stared at it for a moment, then unscrewed the cap and took a small sip. The water was warm but clean. She helped Mara drink, then handed the canteen back. "Thank you," Lena said quietly. He nodded once and returned his attention to the road. Another 10 minutes passed before Lena found the courage to ask, "Why did you buy us?" Holt was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Needed help around the place. It's a lot of work for one person." "We're just kids." "I know. Mara's only 3. She can't do much." "I know that too." Lena frowned, trying to make sense of him. "So why take her?" He glanced at her again, his expression still flat, but something shifting in his eyes. "Because you said not to." Lena didn't know what to say to that. She looked down at Mara, who had finally stopped shaking and was now just leaning heavily against her, exhausted. The wagon rolled on, the wheels creaking over uneven ground, and the silence settled back in. Not hostile, but not comfortable either. Just present. The ranch appeared gradually, coming into view as they crested a low hill. It was smaller than Lena had expected. A single-story house made of logs and rough-cut boards, a barn that leaned slightly to one side, a corral with a few horses, and a chicken coop near the back. Clothes hung on a line strung between 2 posts, flapping gently in the breeze. Everything looked worn but functional, like it had been built by someone who cared about usefulness more than appearance. Holt pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and climbed down. He didn't offer to help Lena this time, just waited while she lifted Mara down and then followed. The ground was hard-packed dirt, dusty and scattered with bits of hay. A few chickens wandered past, pecking at the ground and ignoring them entirely. "House is through there," Holt gestured toward the front door. "There's a room on the left. Used to be storage. I cleared it out this morning. You'll sleep there." Lena blinked. "You cleared it out this morning?" "Figured I'd need somewhere to put you if I brought you back." "You didn't know you were going to buy us?" "No, but I thought about it." He moved past them and pushed open the front door, stepping into the dim interior. Lena hesitated, then took Mara's hand and followed. The inside of the house was plain. Wooden floors, a stone fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, a kitchen area with a stove and a wash basin. Everything was clean but sparse, like someone had taken away anything that wasn't necessary. The room Holt had mentioned was small, barely big enough for the narrow bed and thin mattress he'd put inside. There was a single blanket folded at the foot of the bed, and a wooden crate turned on its side to serve as a makeshift shelf. "You can put your things in there," Holt said, nodding at the crate. Lena almost laughed. "We don't have any things." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded as if that made perfect sense. "Right. Well, you've got the bed and the blanket. I'll see about getting you something else tomorrow." "Why are you doing this?" The question came out sharper than Lena intended, driven by exhaustion and confusion and the weight of everything that had happened in the last few hours. Holt met her eyes. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his gaze, something almost like recognition. Because someone should. He left them there and went back outside. Lena heard his boots on the porch, then the sound of him talking quietly to the horses. Mara tugged on her sleeve. "Is he going to hurt us?" Lena looked around the small room, at the bed that was threadbare but clean, at the way the door didn't have a lock on it. She thought about the way Holt had lifted Mara without roughness, the way he'd handed over the canteen without making a show of it, the way he'd walked away from the auction without looking back to see if they followed. "I don't think so," Lena said slowly, "but we have to be careful." They stayed in the room until evening when Holt knocked on the doorframe and told them supper was ready. He'd made something simple: beans and cornbread, a little bacon fat for flavor. He set 2 plates on the table and then took his own and sat outside on the porch, leaving them alone to eat. Lena ate slowly, watching Mara devour her food with the desperate hunger of a child who'd gone without too many times. When they finished, Lena carried the plates outside. Holt was sitting on the porch steps, his own plate already empty, staring out at the darkening hills. "Thank you for the food," Lena said. He glanced up at her, nodded, and took the plates from her hands. "You know how to wash dishes?" "Yes." "Good. Water's in the basin inside. Wood for the stove is stacked by the door. If you need more, there's an axe in the barn, but don't touch it unless I'm around." "Okay." He stood, brushing dust from his pants. "You'll start helping with chores tomorrow. Nothing heavy, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, things like that. Mara can help where she's able, but I don't expect much from her yet. Understood?" Lena nodded. Holt studied her for a moment, then said, "You don't have to be afraid here. I'm not going to hurt you, but you do have to pull your weight. This isn't charity." "I understand." "Good." He picked up his hat from the porch railing and settled it on his head. "I'll be in the barn if you need anything. Don't wander off after dark. There's coyotes sometimes, and the terrain's rough if you don't know it." He walked away before she could respond, his figure disappearing into the shadows near the barn. Lena stood on the porch for a moment, the night air cooling her skin, and tried to make sense of the day. This morning she'd been standing on an auction block, certain that she and Mara would be separated, sold to people who saw them as labor and nothing else. Now she was here, on a ranch in the middle of nowhere, with a man who spoke in short sentences and didn't smile but had paid $50 to keep them together. She didn't trust it yet, but she wanted to. Inside, Mara was already curled up on the bed, her eyes heavy with sleep. Lena washed the dishes by lamplight, put them away, and then lay down beside her sister. The mattress was thin and the blanket was rough, but it was theirs, at least for tonight. Mara's breathing evened out, soft and steady, and Lena closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she didn't dream of the auction block. The next morning, Holt woke them before dawn. His knock on the door frame was quiet but firm, and when Lena opened her eyes, she saw gray light filtering through the single window. Mara stirred beside her, rubbing her eyes. "Up!" Holt called from the other side of the door. "Chores don't wait." Lena got Mara dressed and then followed the sound of movement to the kitchen. Holt was at the stove, frying eggs in a cast-iron pan. He didn't turn around when they came in, just nodded toward the table where 2 cups of milk were already set out. "Drink that, then come outside." They drank in silence, the milk cool and fresh. Holt finished cooking, divided the eggs onto 3 plates, and they ate quickly. No conversation, just the scrape of forks on tin and the crackle of the stove. When they were done, Holt led them outside into the pale morning light. The ranch looked different in the dawn, softer somehow, the sharp edges blurred by mist that clung to the low places. The chickens were already awake, clucking and scratching in the dirt near their coop. Holt handed Lena a small bucket. "Feed's in the barn, 1 scoop per chicken, scatter it around the coop. Don't let them out until they've eaten, or they'll wander." Lena took the bucket and glanced at Mara, who was standing close to her side, uncertain. Holt noticed and crouched down to Mara's level, his voice gentler than Lena had heard it yet. "You like chickens?" Mara nodded, shy. "Good. You can help your sister. Just don't chase them. They spook easy." He stood and walked toward the barn, leaving them to figure it out. Lena found the feed where he said it would be, a burlap sack filled with cracked corn and seeds. She scooped out a handful and showed Mara how to scatter it, and together they fed the chickens while the sun climbed higher and the mist burned away. It was simple work and strangely calming. The chickens didn't care who they were or where they'd come from. They just ate, pecked, and went about their business. Mara laughed when one of them flapped its wings and hopped onto a fence post, and the sound was so unexpected, so light, that Lena felt something loosen in her chest. Holt returned as they finished, carrying a toolbox and a length of rope. He inspected their work with a quick glance, then nodded. "Good. Now come with me. Fence needs mending." They spent the rest of the morning at the edge of the property, where part of the corral fence had come loose from its posts. Holt worked with steady efficiency, showing Lena how to hold the boards while he hammered, how to tie the rope to reinforce weak joints. Mara sat in the grass nearby, playing with the smooth stone she'd found, her earlier fear fading into cautious curiosity. By midday, the sun was high and brutal, and Holt called a break. They sat in the shade of the barn, drinking water from the same canteen he'd shared on the wagon ride. Lena's hands were sore, her arms aching from holding the boards, but there was a strange satisfaction in seeing the fence standing solid again. Holt leaned back against the barn wall, his hat tipped low over his eyes. For a while he didn't speak. Then, without preamble, he said, "You ever lived on a ranch before?" "No, we lived in town. My mother was a seamstress." "She teach you to sew?" "A little. Mostly she wanted me to go to school." Holt nodded slowly. "School's important. There's one in Red Hollow, but it's a long walk. Might be able to arrange something when winter comes and the work slows down." Lena stared at him, surprised. "You'd let me go to school?" "Why wouldn't I?" "Because you bought us to work." Holt lifted his hat and looked at her directly, his gray eyes tired but clear. "I bought you so you wouldn't get separated. The work's just what we all do to keep going. You're smart enough to need school, you'll go to school. Simple as that." Lena didn't know what to say. She looked down at her hands, at the dirt under her nails, and the calluses already forming on her palms. Beside her, Mara had fallen asleep in the grass, her head pillowed on her arms, her face peaceful. "Why are you being kind to us?" Lena asked quietly. Holt was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm not kind, I'm just not cruel. There's a difference." He stood, brushing dust from his pants, and walked back toward the house. Lena stayed where she was, watching the way the sunlight slanted through the gaps in the barn boards, trying to understand this man who spoke in contradictions and kept his distance but had given them a place to sleep and food to eat and the promise of school. She didn't trust it yet, but she wanted to. The days began to fall into a rhythm. Wake before dawn, chores, breakfast, more work, mending, cleaning, hauling water, tending the garden Holt kept behind the house. Meals were quiet, functional. Evenings were spent on the porch or in their small room, Lena telling Mara stories to help her fall asleep. Holt didn't talk much, but he was always there, a steady, unobtrusive presence. He corrected Lena when she did something wrong, but never harshly. He brought Mara a wooden doll he'd carved, simple and rough, but clearly made with care. He never asked them about their past, and they didn't ask about his. But Lena noticed things. The way he kept the house clean but lived in it like a guest. The way he sometimes stood at the edge of the property at sunset, staring at the mountains with an expression she couldn't read. The way he flinched, just slightly, when Mara laughed too loud or moved too quickly near him, as if he wasn't used to the sound of children, as if it startled something in him. One evening, after Mara had gone to bed, Lena found him on the porch, whittling a piece of wood by lamplight. She sat down on the steps a few feet away, uncertain but curious. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Holt didn't look up from his work. "Go ahead." "Why do you live out here alone?" His hand stilled, the knife pausing mid-stroke. For a moment Lena thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Used to have a family, wife and a son. They died. Fever, 5 years ago." Lena's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." "Me too." He resumed whittling, the shavings falling like snow onto the porch boards. "After that, didn't see much point in being around people, so I came out here." "Do you regret it?" "Regret what?" "Buying us, bringing us here." Holt looked at her then, really looked at her, and there was something raw in his eyes, something he'd been keeping locked away. "No," he said quietly, "I don't regret it." Lena believed him, and for the first time since the auction block, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be something more than survival. Maybe it could be home. The quiet settled between them like dust after a storm, and Lena found herself watching the way Holt's hands moved, steady, purposeful, shaping something from nothing. She stood after a moment, murmured goodnight, and went inside to where Mara slept with one small fist curled beneath her chin. That night, Lena dreamed of her mother's hands threading a needle, the same careful precision, the same silent focus. When she woke, the dream lingered like smoke. 3 weeks passed. The work became familiar. The weight of the water bucket, the rhythm of scattering feed, the way the chickens came running when they heard the coop door open. Mara grew braver, venturing farther from Lena's side, chasing butterflies in the tall grass, talking to the horses in whispered conversations that made Holt's mouth twitch in something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't far from it either. Then one morning, as Lena was hanging laundry on the line, she heard the sound of hooves approaching from the south. She turned, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw two riders coming up the road. Her stomach tightened. Visitors meant questions, and questions meant attention they didn't need. Holt emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He saw the riders and went still, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Go inside," he said to Lena, his voice low. "Take Mara with you." "Who are they?" "Don't know yet. Go." Lena gathered the laundry basket and hurried to the house, calling for Mara. They watched from the window as the riders approached. Two men, one older with a silver badge pinned to his vest, the other younger, clean-shaven, carrying a leather satchel. The older man dismounted with the stiffness of someone who spent too much time in the saddle, and Holt met them halfway between the house and the barn. "Mr. Holt," the man with the badge touched the brim of his hat. "Sheriff Dalton, this here's Mr. Pierce from the county office." Holt nodded once, his expression unreadable. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" "Well, we're here about the girls you took from the auction a few weeks back. There's been some talk in town, questions about the arrangement, about whether it's proper for a single man to be raising two young girls without oversight." Lena's heart dropped into her stomach. Beside her, Mara pressed closer, sensing the shift in the air. Holt's voice remained level. "I paid for them legal. Got the papers to prove it." "That's true," the younger man, Pierce, said, opening his satchel and pulling out a folder. "The transaction was legitimate, but there are concerns about the children's welfare, Mr. Holt. The county has a responsibility to ensure they're being properly cared for. They're fed, they have a roof, they're not mistreated." "I'm sure that's the case," Sheriff Dalton said, his tone careful. "But appearances matter, and people talk. Mrs. Harlan's been vocal about her concerns, says it's not right, a man alone with two girls. She's suggesting the county should reassess the situation." Holt's hands clenched briefly at his sides, then relaxed. "Mrs. Harlan wanted to separate them. I didn't." "Be that as it may," Pierce said, "we need to conduct an inspection. See the living conditions, speak with the children, make sure everything's in order. Standard procedure." Lena felt Mara's small hand slip into hers, trembling. She wanted to run out there, to stand between Holt and these men with their papers and their authority, but she knew it would only make things worse. So she stayed at the window and watched as Holt's shoulders rose and fell with a slow breath. "Fine," he said. "Look around all you want." The men followed Holt toward the house. Lena stepped back from the window, pulling Mara with her, and by the time the door opened, they were standing in the center of the main room, trying to look calm. Sheriff Dalton came in first, his gaze sweeping the space with professional efficiency. Pierce followed, making notes on a pad of paper. "Girls," the sheriff said, his voice gentler than it had been outside. "I'm Sheriff Dalton. This is Mr. Pierce. We're just here to make sure you're doing all right. Nothing to be afraid of." Lena didn't believe him, but she nodded anyway. Mara hid behind her, peeking out with wide eyes. Pierce walked through the house slowly, opening doors, checking corners. He spent extra time in the small room where Lena and Mara slept, examining the bed, the blanket, the crate with the few items Holt had given them: a hairbrush, a bar of soap, 2 tin cups. When he returned to the main room, he was still writing. "The conditions are adequate," Pierce said, his tone neutral. "Spartan, but clean. No signs of neglect or harm." Sheriff Dalton crouched down to Mara's level, his expression kind. "How old are you, sweetheart?" Mara held up 3 fingers, still half hidden behind Lena. "And do you like it here?" Mara nodded slowly. The sheriff looked up at Lena. "What about you? You're the older one, right? Lena?" "Yes, sir." "Has Mr. Holt treated you well?" Lena hesitated, aware of Holt standing near the door, his face impassive. She thought about the last 3 weeks. The quiet meals, the patient teaching, the way he'd carved Mara a doll and never asked for thanks. She thought about the way he'd paid $50 to keep them together when no one else cared. "Yes, sir," she said firmly. "He's been good to us." The sheriff studied her for a long moment, then nodded and stood. "All right. Mr. Pierce, you got what you need?" Pierce flipped through his notes. I'll need to file a report with the county. Recommend a follow-up visit in 6 weeks to ensure continued compliance with welfare standards. But for now, I don't see grounds for immediate removal. Lena felt the tension in her chest ease slightly, but she knew from the tightness in Holt's jaw that this wasn't over. The men left with promises to return, and as their horses disappeared down the road, Holt stood on the porch, silent and still. Lena stepped outside, leaving Mara in the house. Are they going to take us away? Not today. But they might come back. They will come back. What do we do? Holt turned to look at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something close to uncertainty in his eyes. We keep going. Do the work. Stay out of trouble. Hope it's enough. But hope, Lena was learning, was a fragile thing. The days after the visit felt different. Holt was quieter, more watchful. He took them into town only once, for supplies, and even then he kept them close, his hand on Lena's shoulder as they walked past the general store where women whispered and pointed. Mrs. Harlan was there, her gaze sharp and disapproving, and Lena felt the weight of her judgment like a stone. Don't pay her any mind, Holt murmured as they loaded flour and sugar into the wagon. She's got nothing better to do than make trouble. But the trouble was already growing. 2 more visits came in the following weeks, once from Pierce alone, who inspected the house again and asked Lena a series of questions about chores, meals, bedtime. Then a visit from a churchwoman, Mrs. Colby, who brought preserves and asked to pray with them, her eyes lingering on the sparse furnishings, the lack of feminine touches, the silence that hung in the air like dust. Each visit left Holt more tense, more distant. He worked longer hours, came in later, spoke less. Lena tried to help, tried to keep everything clean and orderly, tried to make sure Mara was always neat and well-behaved when anyone came around. But she could feel the scrutiny tightening like a noose. One evening, as she was washing dishes, Holt came in and sat at the table, his hat in his hands. He stared at it for a long time before speaking. They're building a case, he said quietly. Pierce told me today on Mrs. Harlan's got half the town convinced I'm unfit. They're saying a man alone can't raise girls properly, that it's improper, that you'd be better off in a home with a woman or adopted out to a proper family. Lena's hands stilled in the wash basin. We don't want to go to another family. I know. We want to stay here. Holt looked up at her, and the exhaustion in his face was so raw it made her chest ache. What you want doesn't carry much weight with the county, Lena. They'll do what they think is right, and they won't ask you first. Then what do we do? I don't know. The helplessness in his voice scared her more than anything else had. She dried her hands and sat down across from him, her mind racing. What if we ran? Holt's eyes sharpened. Ran where? Somewhere they couldn't find us. Another territory. Canada, maybe? You'd be fugitives. So would I. They'd hunt us down, and when they caught us, it'd be worse for everyone. Then we fight. With what? I'm a rancher, Lena. I don't have lawyers or influence or friends in high places. All I've got is this land and my word, and neither one means much to the people making decisions. Lena felt tears prick her eyes, hot and furious. So we just wait for them to take us? Holt reached across the table and gripped her hand, his rough fingers closing over hers. No, we don't give up, but we have to be smart. We have to show them they're wrong. How? By proving you're thriving here, by showing that this is the best place for you and Mara, by making them see that pulling you out would do more harm than good. It sounded impossible, but Lena nodded, because what else could she do? The next few weeks, Holt changed tactics. He brought them into town more often, made sure they were seen at church on Sundays, introduced them to neighbors he'd mostly ignored before. He bought Lena a new dress, simple but clean, and had Mrs. Colby teach her how to braid Mara's hair properly. He started taking Lena to the general store and letting her handle the shopping, showing the townspeople that she was responsible, capable, growing. It felt like performing, like they were constantly on display. Lena hated it, but she played along because the alternative was unthinkable. Then, on a cold October morning, everything fractured. Lena woke to the sound of voices outside, loud, aggressive, unfamiliar. She sat up, heart pounding, and heard Holt's voice cutting through, sharp and defensive. She scrambled out of bed, pulled on her dress, and ran to the window. There were 4 men this time. Sheriff Dalton, Pierce, and 2 others she didn't recognize, one in a suit, one in work clothes. They were standing near the porch, and Holt was blocking the door, his arms crossed. "You can't just take them," Holt was saying, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "There's been no ruling, no official decision." "There's been a petition," the man in the suit said. He was tall, thin, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a folder tucked under his arm. Signed by 23 residents of Red Hollow, expressing concern for the welfare of the children in your care. The county has authorized a temporary removal pending a formal hearing. A hearing I wasn't told about. You'll be notified of the date. In the meantime, the girls will be placed in a supervised environment. You mean Mrs. Pritchard's basement? That's the county facility, yes. Holt's hands clenched into fists. They were sold out of that basement like livestock. You're going to put them right back there? It's temporary, Mr. Holt. If the hearing goes in your favor, they'll be returned. And if it doesn't? The man in the suit didn't answer. He just gestured to Pierce, who started toward the house. Lena's blood turned to ice. She spun around, grabbed Mara, and pulled her out of bed. Lena, what's happening? Mara's voice was small, frightened. We have to go, right now. Go where? I don't know. Just come on. She dragged Mara toward the back door, her heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe. She could hear boots on the porch, the front door opening, voices calling her name. She shoved the back door open and stumbled into the cold morning air, pulling Mara behind her. They ran. Not toward the road, but toward the hills, the rough, wild country behind the ranch where Holt had told them not to wander. Lena's bare feet slipped on rocks and stubbled grass, and Mara was crying, stumbling, but Lena didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Because if they went back to that basement, if they were separated again, she didn't know if she'd survive it. Behind them, she heard shouting, Holt's voice, angry and desperate. Other voices, commanding her to stop. She didn't look back. She just ran, dragging Mara deeper into the hills as the sun climbed higher and the cold bit through her thin dress. They ran until Mara couldn't run anymore, until she collapsed in a sobbing heap on a rocky outcrop surrounded by juniper and scrub pine. Lena pulled her into her arms, gasping for breath, and looked back the way they'd come. She couldn't see the ranch from here, just hills and sky and the distant line of mountains. They were alone, and it was getting colder. Mara shivered against her, her teeth chattering. I'm scared, Lena. I know. I'm sorry. Are they going to find us? Lena looked around at the empty landscape, at the endless stretch of wilderness that could hide them or kill them, depending on how lucky they were. She thought about Holt, about the way he'd stood on that porch and tried to fight for them. She thought about the basement in Red Hollow, about the auction block, about all the ways the world had tried to break them. I don't know, she whispered, but we're not going back. Not to that place. Not ever. Mara buried her face in Lena's shoulder, and they sat together on the cold rock, two small figures against the vast indifference of the land, waiting for whatever came next. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, and the temperature dropped. Lena tried to keep Mara warm, wrapping her arms around her sister and tucking them both into a hollow between two boulders that blocked some of the wind, but it wasn't enough. Mara's shivering grew worse, her lips turning pale, and Lena felt panic rising in her throat. She'd made a mistake. She knew that now. Running had been instinct, desperation, but it wasn't a plan. They had no food, no water, no shelter. And night was coming. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Lena heard something, the distant sound of footsteps, careful and deliberate. She tensed, ready to run again, but then a familiar voice called out, Lena, Mara! It was Holt, alone. Lena didn't move, didn't answer. She just held Mara tighter, torn between relief and fear. I know you're scared, Holt said, his voice carrying through the stillness. I know you don't want to go back, but you can't stay out here. It's too cold. You'll freeze before morning. Lena closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. She knew he was right. But going back meant facing the men with their papers and their authority, meant losing everything they'd found here. They're gone, Holt said, closer now. I sent them away, told them I'd bring you in myself tomorrow, bought us one night. One night doesn't change anything. No, but it gives us time to figure out what does. Lena opened her eyes and saw him standing a few yards away, his hat in his hands, his face drawn with worry and something else, something that looked almost like fear. "Please," he said quietly. "Come home." Mara stirred in Lena's arms, her voice weak and trembling. "Lena, I'm so cold." Lena looked down at her sister's pale face, at the way her small body shook, and knew she didn't have a choice. She stood slowly, lifting Mara with her, and Holt stepped forward to help. He took Mara into his arms, wrapped his coat around her, and started back toward the ranch without another word. Lena followed, numb and exhausted, her feet bleeding from the rocks. The walk back felt longer than the run-out had been, and by the time they reached the house, the sky was dark and full of stars. Holt carried Mara straight to the bed, wrapped her in every blanket they had, and built up the fire until the room glowed with heat. He made Lena sit by the stove, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and brought her water that she drank without tasting. When Mara's shivering finally stopped and she fell into a restless sleep, Holt sat down across from Lena, his elbows on his knees, his head bowed. "I'm sorry," Lena whispered. "I didn't know what else to do." But Holt looked up at her, and there was no anger in his eyes, just a deep, aching sadness. "You were protecting her. I understand that. But I made it worse, didn't I?" "Maybe. Or maybe you gave us a way to fight back." Lena frowned, confused. Holt leaned forward, his voice low and intense. "Tomorrow, they're going to want to take you. And I can bring you in, let them put you back in that basement, and hope the hearing goes our way. Or I can tell them what happened today, that you ran because you're terrified of being separated, that you'd rather risk freezing to death than go back to the county facility. I can make them see what their decision is doing to you. Will that change anything? I don't know, but it's the truth. And sometimes the truth is the only weapon we've got." Lena looked at Mara, sleeping fitfully under the pile of blankets, and felt something settle in her chest. Not hope, exactly, but something close to it. Determination, maybe. Or just refusal to give up. "Okay," she said. "We tell them the truth." Holt nodded, then stood and moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame, looking back at her. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "you're the bravest person I've ever met." Then he was gone, and Lena sat alone by the fire, listening to the wind outside and the sound of her sister breathing, and tried to believe that brave would be enough. Morning came too soon and brought with it a sky the color of old pewter. Lena woke to find Mara still sleeping, her breathing shallow but steady, and the house filled with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Holt was at the stove, his movements economical, and when he saw Lena emerge from the small room, he nodded toward the table where 2 plates already waited. "Eat," he said. "You'll need your strength." Lena sat, though her stomach felt like a clenched fist. She picked at the food while Holt finished cooking, and when he finally sat down across from her, his own plate untouched, the silence between them was heavy with unspoken fears. "They'll be here by noon," he said. "Sheriff Dalton sent word at first light. The hearing's been moved up, set for tomorrow morning at the courthouse in Red Hollow. They want you there tonight, in county custody, so there's no chance of you running again." Lena's throat went tight. "And if we don't go? Then they'll come with more men, and they'll take you by force, and I'll likely end up in jail for obstruction." Holt's jaw worked, the muscle ticking beneath the stubble. "I won't let it come to that." "So we just give up?" "No, we show up, we face them, and we make them listen." He reached across the table and gripped her hand, his palm rough and warm. "But I need you to trust me, Lena. When we get to that courthouse, when they start asking questions, I need you to tell them exactly what happened yesterday. Don't hold back. Don't try to protect me. Just tell the truth." Lena looked into his eyes and saw something she hadn't seen before. Not certainty, but conviction. The difference mattered. "What if the truth isn't enough? Then at least we'll know we fought with everything we had." The sound of hoofbeats reached them before the knock came. Holt stood, squeezed Lena's shoulder once, and went to the door. Sheriff Dalton stood on the porch, his hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable in a way that might have been decency or might have been duty. Behind him, Pierce waited on horseback, his face impassive. Mr. Holt, the sheriff said, I believe you know why we're here. I do. Holt's voice was steady. Give me 10 minutes to get them ready. Dalton nodded, and Holt closed the door. He turned to Lena, and for a moment his composure cracked, just a flicker, but she saw it. Fear. Not for himself, but for them. Wake Mara, he said quietly. Get her dressed. We're going together. Lena did as she was told, rousing Mara gently, helping her into the clean dress Holt had bought weeks ago. Mara was still groggy, confused, and when she understood what was happening, her eyes filled with tears. I don't want to go, she whispered. I want to stay here. I know, sweetheart, but we have to be brave. Can you be brave for me? Mara nodded, though her chin trembled. Lena braided her hair with shaking fingers, tied it with a scrap of ribbon, and lifted her into her arms. When they emerged from the room, Holt was waiting by the door, his coat on, his hat pulled low. Ready? He asked. Lena nodded, though she felt anything but ready. They stepped out into the cold morning, and Sheriff Dalton helped them into the wagon. His wagon, not Holt's. Holt climbed up beside the sheriff, and Pierce followed on horseback as they started down the road toward Red Hollow. The ride felt like a funeral procession. Nobody spoke. Mara buried her face in Lena's shoulder, and Lena stared at the passing landscape. The hills they'd run through yesterday, the distant line of trees, the sky that seemed to press down on them like a judgment already rendered. She thought about the auction block, about the basement that smelled like mildew, about all the ways the world found to punish children for the crime of being unwanted. They reached Red Hollow just after noon. The town looked the same as it always did. Dusty streets, false front buildings, people going about their business with the kind of indifference that came from seeing too much hardship. But when the wagon rolled past the general store, Lena saw faces turn, saw Mrs. Harlan standing on the boardwalk with her arms crossed, saw the way people whispered and pointed. The courthouse was a squat brick building at the edge of town, newer than most of the structures around it, with tall windows and a bell tower that had never held a bell. Sheriff Dalton pulled the wagon to a stop out front, and Pierce dismounted, tying his horse to the rail. Holt climbed down first, then reached up to help Lena and Mara. The hearing's tomorrow morning, Dalton said, his voice low. But the judge wants to see the children today. Make sure they're settled. Mrs. Pritchard's inside, waiting. Lena's stomach dropped. Holt's hand tightened on her shoulder. I'm coming in with them, Holt said. That's not protocol, Mr. Holt. I don't care about protocol. I'm coming in. Dalton sighed, looked at Pierce, then nodded. Fine, but you stay quiet unless you're spoken to. They went inside, and the courthouse was all dark wood and official silence. A clerk sat at a desk near the entrance, scribbling in a ledger, and down a narrow hallway Lena could see a door marked with a brass plaque that read, Judge Kincaid. But it was the woman standing near the window who made Lena's breath catch. Mrs. Pritchard looked exactly as she had the last time Lena had seen her. Gray dress, cold hands, mouth turned down like she'd tasted something sour. When she saw the girls, her expression didn't change. There you are, she said, as if they'd simply been late for supper. Come along, I've got a room prepared. No. The word came out of Lena before she could stop it, sharp and defiant. Mrs. Pritchard's eyes narrowed. Excuse me? We're not going with you. That's not your decision to make, child. The county has placed you in my care until the hearing concludes. Lena felt Mara trembling against her, felt the weight of every adult in the room watching, waiting. She looked up at Holt, who gave her the smallest nod. Permission, or maybe encouragement. She turned back to Mrs. Pritchard and lifted her chin. You sold us once. You're not taking us again. The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Pritchard's face flushed red and she took a step forward, but Sheriff Dalton moved between them, his hand raised. Now hold on, he said. Let's all calm down. That child is being insolent, Mrs. Pritchard snapped. She needs to learn her place. Her place is with me. Holt's voice cut through the tension like a blade. And if the judge wants to see them, fine. But they're not spending the night in that basement. You have no authority here, Mr. Holt. Maybe not, but I've got a voice and I intend to use it. The door at the end of the hallway opened, and a man stepped out, tall, gray-haired, wearing a black robe that made him look like a crow. Judge Kincaid. He took in the scene with sharp eyes, then gestured for silence. "What's all this commotion?" Sheriff Dalton stepped forward. "Your Honor, we've brought the children as requested, but there's some disagreement about the arrangements for tonight." "I can hear that." Kincaid looked at Mrs. Pritchard, then at Holt, then down at Lena and Mara. His gaze lingered on Mara, who was crying silently, her face pressed into Lena's shoulder. "Bring them into my chambers. All of you. Let's sort this out now rather than drag it into tomorrow." They filed into the judge's chambers, a room lined with law books and smelling of pipe tobacco. Kincaid sat behind a large oak desk and gestured for everyone else to find seats. Holt pulled 2 chairs forward for Lena and Mara, then stood behind them, his hand resting lightly on the back of Lena's chair. Kincaid folded his hands on the desk and looked at Pierce. "Give me the summary." Pierce opened his folder and began reading in a monotone voice. The facts, as he presented them, were cold and procedural. 2 orphaned girls purchased at auction by a single man with no family, living in isolated conditions, complaints filed by concerned citizens, a petition for removal. He mentioned yesterday's incident, the girls fleeing into the hills, as evidence of instability and poor judgment on Holt's part. When he finished, Kincaid turned to Mrs. Pritchard. "And you believe the children would be better served in county custody?" "Without question, Your Honor. Mr. Holt is a bachelor with no experience raising children, particularly girls. It's improper and potentially dangerous. These children need structure, supervision, and a feminine influence." "They need to not be separated," Holt said, his voice tight. Kincaid raised an eyebrow. "You'll have your chance to speak, Mr. Holt. For now, I'm asking questions." He turned to Lena, and his expression softened slightly. "Young lady, I'd like to hear from you. What's your name?" "Lena, sir." "Lena, can you tell me why you ran away yesterday?" Lena glanced up at Holt, who nodded. She took a breath and forced herself to meet the judge's eyes. "Because I was scared." "Scared of what?" "Scared they were going to take Mara away from me. Scared they were going to put us back in that basement where we were before Mr. Holt bought us. Scared we'd get separated again." "Had Mr. Holt done anything to make you afraid of him?" "No, sir. He's been good to us. He gave us food and a place to sleep, and he didn't hurt us. He even said I could go to school when winter came." Her voice cracked. "But those men showed up and said they were taking us, and all I could think about was the auction block, and how nobody cared that Mara was only 3, and how Mrs. Harlan only wanted me, not both of us. So I ran. Because if we went back to the county, I didn't know if we'd ever be together again." Kincaid was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Mara, who had finally lifted her head and was staring at him with red, swollen eyes. "And you, little one, what's your name?" "Mara," she whispered. "Mara, do you like living with Mr. Holt?" Mara nodded. "Can you tell me why?" Mara's voice was so soft, Lena barely heard it. "He made me a doll. And he lets Lena sleep with me. And he doesn't yell." Kincaid's mouth twitched, something that might have been the ghost of a smile. He leaned back in his chair and looked at Holt. "Your turn, Mr. Holt. Why did you take these girls from the auction?" Holt's jaw tightened. "Because they were going to be separated, and that didn't sit right with me. That's a charitable impulse. But charity isn't the same as capability. Mrs. Pritchard raises a valid concern. You're a single man with no family, no wife, no experience with children. What makes you think you can provide what they need?" "I don't know if I can," Holt said bluntly. "But I know what they don't need. They don't need to be treated like property. They don't need to be split up. They don't need to spend another night in a basement wondering if someone's going to come for them." He paused, his voice dropping. "I lost my own family 5 years ago, my wife and son. Fever took them both in the same week. I thought I was done after that. Thought I'd just work the land and keep to myself until my time came. But then I saw these 2 girls on that platform, and I saw the way Lena was holding Mara, and I heard her say, 'Don't take her,' and something in me couldn't walk away. So I didn't. And maybe I'm not the best person to raise them. Maybe I don't know what I'm doing half the time. But I'll be damned if I let them go back to a system that values rules over people." The room fell silent. Even Mrs. Pritchard seemed at a loss for words. Kincaid studied Holt for a long time, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Mr. Pierce," he said finally, "in your inspection of Mr. Holt's property, did you find any evidence of abuse, neglect, or improper conduct?" Pierce hesitated, then shook his head. "No, Your Honor. The conditions were adequate. The children appeared healthy and cared for. And the incident yesterday, the girls running into the hills, do you believe that was a result of mistreatment by Mr. Holt, or fear of being removed from his care?" Pierce glanced at Mrs. Pritchard, then back at the judge. "Based on the testimony here, I'd say the latter." Kincaid nodded slowly. He looked at Mrs. Pritchard. "Your concerns are noted, ma'am, but I'm not convinced that removing these children from Mr. Holt's care serves their best interest. However, I'm also not prepared to dismiss the matter entirely. Here's what's going to happen. The formal hearing will proceed tomorrow as scheduled. I'll hear testimony from both sides, review the documentation, and make a final ruling. In the meantime, the children will remain with Mr. Holt under the condition that he bring them to court tomorrow morning without fail. Sheriff Dalton will accompany them to ensure compliance." Mrs. Pritchard stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. It's my courtroom, Mrs. Pritchard, and I'll run it as I see fit. These children have been through enough upheaval. One more night won't change the outcome, but it might give them a measure of peace." He looked at Lena and Mara, his expression almost kind. "You're dismissed. Go home. Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll settle this properly." Lena felt something break loose in her chest. Not quite relief, but close enough. Holt's hand squeezed her shoulder, and she looked up to see him nodding, his face carefully blank, but his eyes bright with something that might have been gratitude or might have been unshed tears. They left the courthouse in silence, climbing back into the wagon under Sheriff Dalton's watchful eye. The ride back to the ranch felt different this time, not lighter exactly, but less like a march to execution. Mara fell asleep against Lena's side, exhausted from crying, and Lena let herself lean into Holt's solid presence beside her. When they reached the ranch, Dalton helped them down and tipped his hat to Holt. "I'll be back at dawn to escort you to town. Don't make me regret giving you this chance." "You won't," Holt said. Dalton rode away, and they were alone again under a sky that had cleared to a hard, bright blue. Holt carried Mara inside and laid her on the bed, then turned to Lena. "You did good today," he said quietly. Telling the truth like that. It mattered. "Did it? We're not safe yet." "No, but we're not beaten either." He moved to the stove, started building a fire. "Tomorrow's going to be hard. There'll be more questions, more people trying to poke holes in our story. But if we stick together, if we keep telling the truth, we've got a chance." Lena watched him work, this quiet man who had bought them on an impulse and somehow become the only stable thing in their world. What if they take us anyway? Holt's hands stilled. He turned to look at her, and there was something fierce in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before. "Then I'll fight. I'll appeal. I'll make so much noise they'll regret ever bringing this to court. And if all else fails, I'll find a way to get you back. I promise you that." It was a promise he might not be able to keep. They both knew it. But Lena nodded anyway, because sometimes a promise was all you had to hold on to. That night, after a quiet supper and the familiar routine of washing dishes, Lena sat on the porch steps and looked out at the stars. The air was cold enough to sting her lungs, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called, lonely and wild. Holt came out and sat beside her, a blanket draped over his shoulders that he wordlessly shared with her. "My mama used to say the stars were holes in the sky," Lena said softly. "Places where heaven was shining through." "That's a nice thought. Do you think she's up there, watching?" Holt was quiet for a moment. "I think if she is, she's proud of you, the way you've taken care of your sister, the way you stood up in that courthouse today. That took courage." Lena felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm tired of having to be brave." "I know, but that's the thing about bravery. It's not something you choose when you're strong. It's what you do when you're tired and scared and everything's falling apart, and you keep going anyway." He paused. "Your mama would be proud, and for what it's worth, so am I." The tears spilled over then, hot and silent, and Lena didn't bother wiping them away. Holt put his arm around her shoulders, awkward but genuine. and they sat together under the stars while the night deepened around them. Inside, Mara slept peacefully for the first time in days, her wooden doll clutched in one small hand. And somewhere in the darkness, the future waited, uncertain, dangerous, but not yet written. Dawn came cold and clear. Lena woke to the sound of Holt moving through the house, the creak of floorboards and the clink of dishes. She dressed quickly, braided Mara's hair with steady hands, and when they came into the main room, Holt had breakfast waiting, eggs and biscuits, strong coffee for him, and milk for them. They ate without speaking, the silence comfortable now, familiar. When they finished, Holt cleared the table and then knelt down in front of Mara. "Today's going to be a long day," he said gently. "There'll be a lot of talking, a lot of grown-ups saying things you might not understand, but I need you to be patient and stay close to your sister. Can you do that?" Mara nodded solemnly. Holt touched her cheek, then stood and looked at Lena. "Whatever happens today, you remember this. You and Mara are not property. You're people. You have value, and nobody gets to decide your worth except you." Lena felt something settle in her bones, something that felt almost like strength. She took Mara's hand, and together they walked out into the morning to face whatever judgment waited for them in Red Hollow. Sheriff Dalton arrived as promised, his horse kicking up dust as he rode into the yard. He dismounted, nodded to Holt, and helped the girls into the wagon. The ride to town was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts, and when they arrived at the courthouse, a small crowd had already gathered. Mrs. Harlan was there, along with several other women from the church. A few ranchers stood near the hitching post talking in low voices, and on the courthouse steps, looking official and cold, stood Pierce with his leather satchel and Mrs. Pritchard with her disapproving frown. Holt lifted Mara down from the wagon, then helped Lena. He kept them close as they walked through the crowd, ignoring the whispers and stares, and when they reached the courthouse doors, he paused and looked down at them. "Ready?" Lena squeezed Mara's hand. "Ready." They stepped inside and the doors closed behind them with a sound like finality. The hearing was about to begin, and whatever happened next would determine whether they walked out of this building together or lost each other forever to the machinery of good intentions and bad laws. But Lena had told the truth, and Holt had made a promise. And sometimes, in a world that dealt mostly in cruelty and indifference, that was enough to tip the scales. The courtroom was smaller than Lena had imagined, with wooden benches arranged in neat rows and windows that let in cold morning light. Judge Kincaid sat behind his bench, his black robe stark against the pale wood, and a clerk sat to his right with a pen poised over a ledger. The room smelled of old paper and floor wax, and every sound, footsteps, whispers, the scrape of a chair, seemed to echo off the walls. Holt guided them to a bench near the front, and they sat with Mara between them. Behind them, the benches filled with townspeople, some curious, some concerned, some just looking for entertainment on a slow Tuesday morning. Lena could feel their eyes on her back, could hear the rustle of skirts, and the low murmur of judgment. Mrs. Pritchard sat across the aisle with Pierce, her spine rigid, her hands folded in her lap. Mrs. Harlan was there too, along with several other women whose faces Lena recognized from church. They looked at Holt the way people looked at something distasteful, something that needed to be dealt with and put away. Judge Kincaid rapped his gavel once, and the room fell silent. "This hearing is called to order. We're here to determine the custody arrangement for Lena and Mara." He paused, glancing at his papers. "No last name listed. 2 minors currently in the care of Caleb Holt, pursuant to a legal purchase from a county auction held 6 weeks ago. The petition before me requests removal of the children from Mr. Holt's custody on grounds of impropriety and inadequate supervision. Mr. Pierce, you may present the county's case." Pierce stood, his suit perfectly pressed, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the light. He opened his folder and began speaking in a voice that was calm, measured, and completely devoid of emotion. "Your Honor, the county's position is straightforward. While Mr. Holt's purchase of the children was technically legal, the arrangement is inappropriate by any reasonable standard. Mr. Holt is an unmarried man with no family support, no experience in child rearing, and no female presence in his household. The children are living in isolated conditions with minimal social interaction, limited educational opportunities, and no proper moral guidance. Furthermore, 2 days ago, the children fled Mr. Holt's property and spent several hours exposed to the elements, a clear indication that they do not feel safe or secure in his care. He went on, citing regulations and precedents, painting a picture of a well-meaning but fundamentally unsuitable guardian. Lena felt each word like a stone, heavy and cold. Beside her, Mara had gone very still, her small hand gripping Lena's so tight it hurt. When Pierce finished, Judge Kincaid nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Pierce. Mrs. Pritchard, I understand you have testimony to offer?" Mrs. Pritchard stood, smoothing her gray dress. "Yes, Your Honor. I've been managing the county facility for orphaned and abandoned children for 12 years. In that time, I've seen many unfortunate situations, but this one is particularly troubling. These girls need structure, discipline, and feminine guidance, things Mr. Holt cannot provide. They need to be prepared for proper domestic service or marriage, taught skills that will make them useful members of society. Under Mr. Holt's care, they're running wild, without supervision or correction. The incident 2 days ago proves my point. Children who feel safe don't run away." Lena wanted to stand up and scream that they hadn't run from Holt. They'd run from her, from the basement, and the cold hands, and the certainty of being separated. But Holt's hand came to rest on her shoulder, steady and firm, holding her in place. Judge Kincaid looked at Mrs. Pritchard. "In your professional opinion, where should these children be placed?" "Back in county custody until suitable families can be found. Preferably families with both a mother and father, people of good standing who can provide a proper Christian home." "And if such families can't be found?" Mrs. Pritchard's mouth thinned. "Then they remain in the facility until they're old enough for service positions. It's not ideal, but it's better than the current situation." Kincaid made a note, then looked up. "Mrs. Harlan, I see you're listed as a witness. Please stand." Mrs. Harlan rose, her face flushed with righteous purpose. "Your Honor, I tried to adopt the older girl at the auction. I offered fair payment and could have given her a good home, taught her a trade in my husband's dress shop. But Mr. Holt interfered, paid an exorbitant sum for both children, and has since kept them isolated on his property. It's unseemly, Your Honor. A grown man living alone with 2 young girls. People talk. And in a small town like Red Hollow, reputation matters. These children deserve better than to be the subject of gossip and speculation." "Did you want both children, Mrs. Harlan, or just the older one?" Mrs. Harlan hesitated. "Well, I offered for the older one. The younger child is too small to be useful yet." "I see. And if you'd been successful in your bid, what would have happened to the younger child?" "I suppose she would have been sold separately. That's how these things work." Kincaid's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Harlan. You may sit." He turned his attention to Holt. "Mr. Holt, you'll have an opportunity to respond to these allegations, but first, I'd like to hear from the children themselves." He looked at Lena. "Young lady, please stand." Lena's legs felt unsteady as she rose. Every eye in the room was on her, and she could feel the weight of their expectations. Some wanting her to condemn Holt, others hoping she'd defend him, all of them ready to judge whatever she said. "Lena," Judge Kincaid said, his voice gentler than it had been, "I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to answer them honestly. Nobody here is going to punish you for telling the truth. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Good. First question. Do you feel safe living with Mr. Holt?" Lena thought about the last 6 weeks, the quiet meals, the patient teaching, the way Holt had never raised his voice or his hand, even when she made mistakes. The way he'd carved Mara a doll and promised Lena could go to school. The way he'd stood on the courthouse steps yesterday and fought for them when it would have been easier to walk away. "Yes, sir. I feel safe. Has Mr. Holt ever struck you or your sister?" "No, sir." "Has he ever threatened you or made you feel afraid of him?" "No, sir." "Does he provide adequate food and shelter?" "Yes, sir. We eat every day, and we have a bed and blankets." Kincaid nodded. "Now, about 2 days ago, you ran away from Mr. Holt's property. Can you tell me why?" Lena took a breath, willing her voice to stay steady. "We didn't run away from Mr. Holt. We ran away from the men who came to take us. They said we had to go back to the county facility, back to Mrs. Pritchard's basement. and I remembered what it was like there. The cold and the smell and the way she looked at us like we were a burden. And I remembered the auction block, and how Mrs. Harlan only wanted me, not Mara. And all I could think was that if we went back, they'd separate us. So I grabbed Mara and we ran. You were afraid of being separated from your sister? Yes, sir. She's only 3. She needs me. And you believe that if you returned to county custody, you would be separated? Lena looked at Mrs. Pritchard, whose face had gone stony. Yes, sir. Mrs. Harlan already said she only wanted one of us. And Mrs. Pritchard told us at the auction that we were being sold together or separate, whatever people were willing to pay for. Nobody cared that we were sisters. Nobody cared that Mara's too little to be alone. They just cared about the money. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Kincaid raised his hand for silence, then looked at Mrs. Pritchard. Is that accurate, Mrs. Pritchard? Were you prepared to sell the children separately? Mrs. Pritchard's jaw tightened. The county's priority is to place children in homes as quickly as possible. If that means separating siblings, then yes, we do what's necessary. I see. Kincaid made another note, then returned his attention to Lena. One more question. If I were to ask you where you want to live, what would you say? Lena didn't hesitate. With Mr. Holt, on the ranch. With Mara. Why? Because he's the only person who's ever cared that we stay together. Because he treats us like we matter. Because when I told him not to take her, he listened. Her voice cracked, but she pushed through. He's not perfect, and maybe he doesn't know everything about raising kids, but he's trying, and he keeps his promises, and that's more than anybody else has done for us. Kincaid studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Thank you, Lena. You may sit. Lena sank back onto the bench, her heart pounding. Holt's hand found her shoulder again, a brief squeeze of reassurance. Beside her, Mara was crying silently, tears streaming down her cheeks, and Lena pulled her close. Mr. Holt, Judge Kincaid said, please stand and approach the bench. Holt stood, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He walked to the front of the courtroom and stopped a few feet from the judge's bench, his hat in his hands, his expression calm. Mr. Holt, you've heard the testimony against you. The county believes you're an unsuitable guardian for these children. What's your response? Holt was quiet for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. Then he said, they're right about some things. I'm not married, I don't have family nearby, I've never raised children before, and I don't know all the things I should. But they're wrong about the most important thing. They think I took these girls to use them, to get cheap labor, or to satisfy some need. That's not why I did it. Then why did you? Because I saw 2 kids on an auction block being sold like animals, and I saw the older one trying to protect the younger one, and I couldn't walk away. My wife and son died 5 years ago, and for a long time after that I didn't see the point in much of anything. I worked the land because it needed working, and I kept breathing because stopping seemed like too much effort. But when I heard that little girl say, don't take her, something in me woke up, and I thought maybe I could do one decent thing. Maybe I could keep them together. So I paid the money, and I brought them home. And I've been trying every day since to give them something better than what they had. The county argues that you can't provide proper moral guidance or feminine influence. The county's right. I can't teach them to sew or to manage a household the way a woman could, but I can teach them to work hard and to be honest and to stand up for what's right. I can make sure they eat and sleep safe and don't have to wonder if tomorrow they'll be torn apart and sold to different people. And when winter comes and the work slows, I'll take Lena into town for school like I promised, because she's smart and she deserves better than to spend her life scrubbing floors. What about Mara? She's very young. She is. Too young for hard work. So she helps where she can, gathering eggs, pulling weeds in the garden, but mostly she just plays. Kids should get to play. Holt's voice roughened. My son was 4 when he died. He liked to chase chickens and build things out of sticks. Mara reminds me of him sometimes. The way she laughs when something surprises her. The way she falls asleep with that doll I made her. And maybe that's selfish of me. Maybe I'm keeping them because they fill some hole that's been empty too long. But I don't think wanting to take care of someone is a bad reason to do it. Judge Kincaid leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The law is clear about what constitutes a suitable home, Mr. Holt. It requires stability, moral instruction, and proper supervision. On paper, your household doesn't meet those standards, but the law is also supposed to serve the best interests of the child. So I'm going to ask you directly, what do you think is in the best interest of these two girls? Holt looked back at the bench where Lena and Mara sat huddled together. His eyes met Lena's and something passed between them. Understanding, maybe, or trust. He turned back to the judge. I think they need to stay together. I think they need someone who sees them as people, not problems. And I think pulling them out of a place where they finally feel safe, just to satisfy some notion of propriety, would do more harm than any lack of feminine influence ever could. The courtroom was silent. Judge Kincaid sat motionless, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at Pierce. Mr. Pierce, in your professional assessment, if these children are removed from Mr. Holt's custody, what's the likelihood they'll be adopted together? Pierce shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, given their ages and the fact that they're sisters, it would be challenging. Most families prefer younger children, and taking two at once is a significant commitment. So they'd likely be separated. It's possible, yes. And if they remain in county custody long term, what's their future? Pierce glanced at Mrs. Pritchard, then back at the judge. They'd be placed in service positions when they're old enough, domestic work most likely. With no education? The county facility provides basic instruction in reading and arithmetic, but no formal schooling. No, Your Honor. Resources are limited. Kincaid nodded slowly. He looked at Mrs. Harlan. Mrs. Harlan, if I were to grant your petition and place the older girl in your care, would you be willing to take the younger one as well? Mrs. Harlan's face flushed. Your Honor, I simply don't have the capacity. That's a no, then. It's not that I don't care about the child's welfare, but she's too young to contribute, and my husband and I have our own children to consider, so I understand. You may sit. The judge turned his attention back to the courtroom, scanning the faces gathered there. Is there anyone present who would be willing to adopt both children, providing them with a stable home and keeping them together? Silence. People looked at each other, shifted in their seats, but nobody spoke. Lena felt her chest tighten, felt the crushing weight of unwantedness settle over her like a blanket. Beside her, Mara had gone very still, barely breathing. Judge Kincaid waited, giving the silence time to stretch and break and reform. Then he sighed. The court has heard testimony from both sides. The law requires me to consider the welfare of the children above all other concerns. The county has raised valid points about the unconventional nature of Mr. Holt's household. However, the evidence presented shows that the children are adequately fed, housed, and cared for. More importantly, they feel safe in Mr. Holt's care and desperately wish to remain together. Given that no alternative placement has been offered that would keep them together, and given that removal would likely result in their separation and placement in institutional care with limited prospects for education or advancement, I'm ruling in favor of Mr. Holt. A collective gasp ran through the courtroom. Mrs. Pritchard stood abruptly. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. It's my courtroom, Mrs. Pritchard, and I'll run it as I see fit. Kincaid's voice was sharp. However, this ruling comes with conditions. Mr. Holt, you will ensure that Lena receives formal education, either through the town school or private instruction. You will submit to quarterly inspections by the county to verify that conditions remain adequate. And you will make arrangements for the children to have regular interaction with respectable women in the community who can provide guidance on matters you're not equipped to address. Do you accept these terms? Holt's voice was steady. Yes, Your Honor. Then custody is granted, subject to review in 6 months. If at that time the conditions have been met and the children continue to thrive, the arrangement will become permanent. He rapped his gavel once. This hearing is concluded. The courtroom erupted. People talking, some angry, some approving, all of them with opinions they needed to voice. But Lena heard none of it. She turned to Holt, and he was looking down at her with something in his eyes that might have been relief or might have been the beginning of hope. We can stay? Her voice was barely a whisper. You can stay. Mara launched herself at Holt, wrapping her small arms around his leg and crying into his pants. He bent down and picked her up, holding her with an awkwardness that was becoming familiar, and Lena saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. Sheriff Dalton appeared at their side, his expression carefully neutral. "Congratulations, Mr. Holt. I'll be by next week to verify you're following through on the judge's conditions." "I will be." "See that you are." Dalton tipped his hat and moved away, and Pierce followed him out without a word, his folder tucked under his arm. Mrs. Pritchard stopped in front of them, her face rigid with disapproval. "This is a mistake, Mr. Holt. Those children need proper guidance, and you can't provide it." "Maybe not," Holt said quietly, "but I can give them something you never did, a chance to stay together." Mrs. Pritchard's mouth opened, then closed. She turned and walked away, her spine stiff, and Lena felt a fierce satisfaction watching her go. Mrs. Harlan passed without speaking, but her look said everything: disdain, judgment, the certainty that they were all headed for ruin. A few other women followed her out, whispering behind gloved hands, but not everyone left in disapproval. Mrs. Colby, the churchwoman who had visited the ranch weeks ago, stopped and touched Lena's shoulder. "You're a brave girl," she said softly. "And you, Mr. Holt, you did a good thing today. If you need help with the schooling or anything else, you let me know." "Thank you, ma'am," Holt said. She smiled and moved on, and slowly the courtroom emptied. Soon it was just the three of them standing in the pale morning light, the future suddenly vast and uncertain, but theirs to shape. "Let's go home," Holt said. They walked out of the courthouse into a day that had turned bright and cold. The crowd had mostly dispersed, though a few stragglers remained watching. Holt lifted Mara into the wagon, helped Lena up, and climbed onto the bench beside them. He took the reins, clicked his tongue, and the horses started forward. Red Hollow fell away behind them, and the road opened up ahead, rutted and dusty and leading back to the ranch. Lena leaned against Holt's solid shoulder, feeling Mara's warm weight on her other side, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she allowed herself to believe that maybe they would be all right. The ride was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence now, filled with the creak of the wagon and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats. When they crested the hill and the ranch came into view, Lena felt something settle in her chest, something that felt almost like belonging. Holt pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and helped them down. Mara ran immediately to the chicken coop, laughing as the birds scattered, and Holt watched her with an expression Lena couldn't quite read. "Thank you," Lena said quietly. Holt looked down at her. "For what?" "For fighting for us. For keeping your promise." He was quiet for a moment, then he knelt down so they were eye to eye. "I didn't do it for thanks, Lena. I did it because it was right, and because you two deserve someone who will fight for you. Nobody ever has before." "Well, you've got someone now." He stood, brushing dust from his knees. "Come on. We've got chores to do, and standing around won't get them done." It was so ordinary, so perfectly normal, that Lena almost laughed. They'd just won a battle in a courtroom, had their entire future decided by a judge's gavel, and Holt's response was to go back to work. But maybe that was the point. Maybe normal was what they needed most. She helped him with the afternoon chores, feeding the chickens, checking the horses, hauling water from the well. Mara followed them around, chattering about the chickens and the wagon ride and whether they could have biscuits for supper. And slowly, the tension of the last few days began to ease. That evening, after a simple meal of beans and cornbread, they sat on the porch and watched the sun sink toward the mountains. The sky turned gold and orange and deep purple, and the first stars began to appear. Mara fell asleep in Lena's lap, her breathing soft and even, and Holt sat beside them, whittling a piece of wood by lamplight. "What are you making?" Lena asked. "Horse. Thought Mara might like it." "She'll love it." He didn't respond, just kept working, the knife moving with practiced precision. After a while, he said, "Tomorrow we'll start figuring out the schooling situation. Mrs. Colby mentioned she knows a teacher who might be willing to come out a few times a week. It won't be the same as going to town every day, but it'll be something. You don't have to do that. Judge said I had to. Besides, you're smart. Be a waste not to use it." Lena looked down at Mara's sleeping face, then out at the darkening land. "Do you think they'll really leave us alone now? The county, I mean. For a while. They'll come for the inspections, ask their questions, make sure we're following the rules. But as long as we do what we're supposed to, they'll eventually lose interest. People always do." He paused, the knife stilling. You worried? A little. It feels like it could all fall apart so easily. It could, Holt said honestly. Life doesn't come with guarantees, Lena, but we'll handle whatever comes. That's all any of us can do. It wasn't a reassuring answer exactly, but it was an honest one. And Lena was learning that with Holt, honesty mattered more than comfort. They sat together as the night deepened, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called again, its voice rising and falling like a question with no answer. But here, on this porch, with Mara sleeping peacefully and Holt carving by lamplight, Lena felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt like she was home. The weeks that followed the hearing unfolded with a rhythm that was both strange and comforting. Holt kept his word about the schooling, and within 10 days, Mrs. Colby had arranged for Miss Adelaide Warren, a widow who'd taught school in Red Hollow before her husband died, to come to the ranch 3 afternoons a week. She arrived on a gentle mare, her saddlebags filled with books and slate boards, and she taught Lena reading and arithmetic and history at the kitchen table while Mara sat nearby, drawing pictures with charcoal on scraps of wood. Miss Warren was patient and kind, with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and hands that were always ink-stained. She never asked questions about the hearing or the arrangement, just taught with a quiet competence that reminded Lena of her mother. And when she left each afternoon, she always told Lena she was doing well, that she had a sharp mind and shouldn't waste it. The county inspections came as promised. Sheriff Dalton appeared once a month, looked around the house with a professional eye, asked Lena a few questions about meals and chores and whether she felt safe, then left with a nod and a notation in his ledger. Pierce came once, took extensive notes, and left without comment. Even Mrs. Colby visited occasionally, bringing preserves or fabric scraps, her presence less about inspection and more about genuine concern. Through it all, life on the ranch continued. The work never stopped. Fences needed mending, animals needed tending, winter preparations had to be made before the first snow. Lena learned to chop kindling without cutting herself, to read the sky for weather, to recognize when the chickens were getting broody. Mara grew taller and braver, venturing farther from the house, talking to the horses like they were old friends, laughing more often than she cried. And Holt remained Holt, quiet, steady, present. He taught them things without fanfare, corrected mistakes without harshness, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the walls he'd built around himself began to crack. It happened in small moments. The way he smiled when Mara showed him a rock she'd found that looked like a heart. The way he asked Lena about her lessons, genuinely interested in what she was learning. The way he started saying goodnight instead of just nodding and walking away. The way he carved more things, a bird for Lena, a rabbit for Mara, little gifts left on the kitchen table without explanation. October turned to November, and the first snow came early, dusting the hills in white and turning the ranch into something out of a storybook. Holt showed them how to bank the fire for warmth without wasting wood, how to wrap the water pump so it wouldn't freeze, how to layer clothes against the cold. They spent evenings by the fire, Holt reading from a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe, while the girls listened, mesmerized by tales of survival and resourcefulness. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Mara climbed into Holt's lap without asking, something she'd never done before. He stiffened for a moment, uncertain, then carefully adjusted his arms to hold her. She fell asleep there, her head against his chest, and Lena saw something in his face that made her throat tight. A mixture of grief and gratitude, loss and hope. "You miss them," Lena said quietly. "Your wife and son." Holt didn't look away from the fire. "Every day." "Does it get easier?" "No, but you learn to carry it, and sometimes you find new things to care about that make the weight a little lighter." He glanced down at Mara, sleeping peacefully. "She's about the age my boy was. Reminds me of him sometimes, the way she trusts so easily, even after everything she's been through. Is that hard for you, the reminder?" "At first it was. Now it's—" He paused, searching for words. "Now it's like having a piece of him back in a way. Not the same, but something good, something worth protecting." Lena understood then, in a way she hadn't before, that Holt wasn't just giving them a home. They were giving him something too, a reason to keep going, a purpose beyond just survival. It was an exchange, silent and unspoken, but real nonetheless. December brought heavier snows and shorter days. The ranch became an island in a white sea, isolated but self-sufficient. They had enough supplies to last through winter, flour and beans and preserved vegetables, wood stacked high against the barn, hay for the horses. The world beyond the property line seemed very far away, and for a while that felt like a blessing. But isolation had its costs. Mara caught a fever in mid-December, and for 3 terrifying days she burned with heat, her small body shaking with chills despite every blanket they piled on her. Holt rode through a blizzard to fetch the doctor from Red Hollow, returning half-frozen with a bearded man who smelled of whiskey and carbolic acid. The doctor examined Mara, dosed her with quinine, and told them to keep her warm and hydrated. Lena didn't leave Mara's side for 2 days, sponging her forehead with cool water, coaxing her to drink, singing the songs their mother used to sing. Holt came in and out, bringing fresh water, stoking the fire, his face drawn with worry. On the 3rd night, when Mara's fever finally broke and she opened her eyes and asked for water in a clear voice, Lena burst into tears. Holt put his hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. "She's all right. You did good, Lena." "I was so scared." "I know, me too." It was the first time he'd admitted fear, and somehow that made Lena feel less alone. They sat together through that night, watching Mara sleep peacefully for the first time in days, and when dawn came pale and cold through the window, Lena understood something fundamental. They weren't just living in the same house anymore. They were a family. The county inspection came in January, delayed by weather, but inevitable. Sheriff Dalton arrived on a clear, bitter cold day, his horse's breath steaming in the frozen air. He checked the house, noted the school books on the table, spoke with Lena about her progress with Miss Warren. He watched Mara play with her carved animals near the fire, healthy and content. Then he sat down with Holt at the kitchen table and went through his checklist. Children appear well-fed and healthy. House is clean and adequately heated. Education is being provided as ordered. Miss Warren speaks highly of Lena's progress. He made notes as he talked. "Mrs. Colby reports regular contact and no concerns. Everything seems to be in order, Mr. Holt." "That's good to hear." Dalton set down his pen and looked at Holt directly. "I'll be honest with you, I had my doubts about this arrangement. Thought maybe the judge was being too lenient, too willing to overlook the irregularities. But I was wrong. Whatever you're doing here, it's working. Those girls are thriving." Holt's expression didn't change, but Lena saw his shoulders relax slightly. "I'm just doing what needs doing. It's more than that, and you know it." Dalton stood, gathering his papers. "The 6-month review is coming up in March. Based on what I've seen, I'll be recommending the arrangement become permanent. Barring any unforeseen circumstances, you should have clear custody by spring." After Dalton left, Holt sat at the table for a long time, staring at nothing. Lena came and sat across from him. "What are you thinking about?" "That it's real now, or it will be come spring. You'll be mine legally, not just on paper from an auction, properly mine." "Does that scare you?" He looked at her, and there was something raw in his expression. "Terrifies me. I keep waiting to mess this up, to do something wrong that proves everyone right about me being unfit. But then I look at you two and I think maybe I'm doing all right after all." "You are," Lena said firmly. "You're doing more than all right." He reached across the table and squeezed her hand briefly, then stood and went back to work, as if emotion was something to be acknowledged and then set aside. But Lena saw the way his hand shook slightly as he pulled on his coat, and she knew the weight of responsibility he carried. February brought a thaw, then more snow, then another thaw. The world was mud and slush, and the promise of spring still weeks away. Miss Warren continued her visits, and Lena devoured everything she taught, grammar and literature and geography. She learned about places beyond the Montana Territory, about history and science and mathematics, and every lesson made her hungry for more, made her understand how much she didn't know and how vast the world was beyond this ranch. One afternoon, as Miss Warren was packing up her books, she said, "Lena, you're bright enough to go to a proper school, maybe even a normal school someday, if you wanted to become a teacher yourself." A teacher? The idea had never occurred to her. "Why not? You're quick, you retain information, and you explain things well when you help Mara with her letters. You could do it, if you wanted." Lena looked at Holt, who was repairing a harness near the fire. He glanced up and met her eyes. You want to be a teacher, Lena? You'll be a teacher. We'll figure out how. It was said simply, matter-of-factly, as if her dreams were just another problem to be solved with work and planning. And maybe that's all they were. Maybe dreams weren't magical things that happened to special people. Maybe they were just goals you worked toward, one day at a time. March came in like the lion everyone said it would, bringing wind that rattled the windows and rain that turned the roads to rivers of mud. The 6-month review was scheduled for the 15th, and as the date approached, Lena felt anxiety creeping back in. She knew Dalton had recommended permanent custody, but she also knew that recommendations could be ignored, that judges could change their minds, that nothing was certain until it was over. The night before the review, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the darkness listening to Mara's soft breathing, trying to convince herself that everything would be fine. But fear had its own logic, and logic said that good things didn't last, that happiness was temporary, that the world took away what it gave. She got up quietly and went to the main room. Holt was sitting by the dying fire, still dressed, staring into the embers. He looked up when she appeared. "Can't sleep?" "No." "Me neither." He gestured to the chair beside him. "Sit." She sat, and for a while they just watched the fire together. Then Holt said, "You're worried about tomorrow, aren't you?" "Some, but I think it'll be all right. Dalton's a good man, and he keeps his word. If he said he'd recommend permanent custody, he will." "But what if the judge says no anyway?" "Then we appeal. And if that doesn't work, we find another way." He looked at her, his face serious in the firelight. "I made you a promise, Lena. I said I'd fight for you and Mara, and I meant it. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever happens after that, I'm not giving up on you." "Why?" The question came out broken. "Why do you care so much? We're not your children. We're not even related to you." Holt was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "When my son died, I thought that part of my life was over. Thought I'd never have that again, someone to care for, someone who needed me. And for 5 years I was fine with that, or at least I told myself I was. Then I saw you on that auction block, and something in me recognized something in you. You were fighting for her, the same way I would have fought for my boy if I'd had the chance. And I thought, here's this kid who's tougher and braver than most grown men I know, and she's about to get torn apart by a system that doesn't care about her. And I couldn't let that happen." He paused, swallowing hard. "You asked me once if I regretted buying you. The truth is, you and Mara are the best thing that's happened to me in 5 years. You gave me a reason to get up in the morning that wasn't just habit. You made this house feel like a home again instead of a place I was waiting to die in. So no, you're not my blood. But you're mine in every way that matters, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take you away." Lena felt tears streaming down her face, hot and silent. She'd spent so long being strong, being brave, holding everything together, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to let someone else carry the weight. But here was Holt, this quiet man who'd bought them on an impulse and somehow become the father neither of them had ever had, telling her she was wanted, telling her she mattered. "I love you," she whispered. "You and this place and the life we have here. I don't want to lose it." Holt's voice broke. "You won't. I promise you won't." He pulled her into his arms, awkward and careful, and she let herself cry against his shoulder while he held her. And when the tears finally stopped and the fire had burned down to nothing but ash and memory, they sat together in the darkness and waited for morning. The review was held in the same courthouse, in the same room, with the same judge presiding. But this time felt different. The courtroom was nearly empty, just Holt, Lena, Mara, Sheriff Dalton, Pierce, and a clerk to record the proceedings. Mrs. Pritchard and Mrs. Harlan were notably absent, and Lena felt a fierce satisfaction at their absence. Judge Kincaid reviewed the reports in silence, his expression neutral. Then he looked up at Dalton. "Sheriff, your assessment." "Your Honor, I've conducted monthly inspections as ordered. The children are healthy, well cared for, and receiving appropriate education. Mr. Holt has complied with every condition set by this court. In my professional opinion, the arrangement should be made permanent." Kincaid nodded and turned to Pierce. "Mr. Pierce?" "The county has no objections, Your Honor. Mr. Holt has exceeded our expectations." The judge made a note, then looked at Lena. "Lena, has anything changed since we last spoke? Do you still wish to remain in Mr. Holt's care? Yes, sir. More than anything. And you, young Mara? Are you happy? Mara nodded vigorously, then said in her small, clear voice, He's my papa now. A smile flickered across Kincaid's face, brief but genuine. He looked at Holt. Mr. Holt, the court finds that you have fulfilled all conditions set forth in the original ruling. The children are thriving in your care, and there is no evidence to suggest that alternative placement would serve their best interests. Therefore, I'm granting permanent custody of Lena and Mara to Caleb Holt, effective immediately. The county will no longer have supervisory authority, though you're welcome to continue the educational arrangements you've established. He paused, then added, For the record, Mr. Holt, what you've done here is remarkable. Not many men would have taken on this responsibility, and fewer still would have seen it through with the dedication you've shown. These girls are fortunate to have you. Holt's voice was steady but thick. I'm the fortunate one, Your Honor. Kincaid signed a document, handed it to the clerk, then rapped his gavel once. Custody is granted. This case is closed. And just like that, it was over. 6 months of uncertainty, of fear, of living on the edge of losing everything, gone in a single sentence. Lena looked at Holt, who was staring at the papers the clerk handed him as if they might disappear if he looked away. Mara was tugging on his sleeve, asking if they could go home now, and he bent down and lifted her into his arms. Yes, sweetheart, we can go home. They walked out of the courthouse into a March morning that smelled like rain and new grass. The sky was clearing, patches of blue breaking through the clouds, and the air had that peculiar brightness that comes after a storm. Holt helped them into the wagon, and as they started down the road toward the ranch, Lena felt something settle deep in her bones. Peace, maybe, or just the simple certainty that they were safe. The ride back was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that comes from contentment rather than fear. Mara fell asleep against Lena's shoulder, and Lena watched the landscape roll past. The hills still brown from winter but showing the first hints of green, the sky vast and open, the road leading home. When they reached the ranch, Holt carried Mara inside and laid her on the bed. She stirred but didn't wake, and he stood there for a moment, just looking at her. Then he turned to Lena. I need to tell you something. What? If you want to go to that normal school someday, the one Miss Warren mentioned, we'll make it happen. I'll save up, find a way to send you, even if it means working twice as hard. You're smart enough to do something more than this ranch, and I won't be the one to hold you back. Lena felt her eyes prick with tears again. What if I want to stay? Then you stay. But I want you to know you have choices. You're not trapped here, Lena. This is your home for as long as you want it to be, but you're free to build whatever life you choose. She thought about that, about freedom and choice, and the future stretching out before her like an unmarked trail. And she realized that for the first time in her life, she actually believed she could choose, that her future wasn't something that would just happen to her, but something she could shape. I want to be a teacher, she said, but I want to come back here too. This is home. Holt smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. Then that's what we'll work toward. That evening, they celebrated with a dinner that was simple but felt like a feast. Roasted chicken that Holt had been saving, biscuits with butter, canned peaches for dessert. They ate at the table together, talking and laughing, and when the meal was done, Holt pulled out a piece of paper. I had the clerk draw this up, he said, unfolding it. Legal adoption papers. They weren't required for the custody arrangement, but I wanted them anyway. Makes it official. Makes you my daughters, not just wards. If you're willing to sign, that is. Lena stared at the document, at the formal language that would make them Lena Holt and Mara Holt, that would tie them to this man and this place, not just legally, but permanently. She thought about the auction block, about being nameless and unwanted, about all the ways the world had tried to break them. And then she thought about the life they'd built here, the quiet mornings, the hard work, the small kindnesses, the way Holt had fought for them when no one else would. She picked up the pen and signed her name carefully, each letter deliberate. Then she helped Mara make her mark, a wobbly X that would serve as her signature until she learned to write. Holt signed last, his handwriting neat and precise, and when it was done, he folded the paper and set it aside. Welcome to the family, he said quietly. We were already family, Lena said. This just makes it official. That night, after Mara had gone to bed, Lena sat on the porch and looked up at the stars. The sky was clear and vast, filled with more stars than seemed possible, each one a point of light in the darkness. She thought about her mother, wondered if she was up there somewhere, watching. Wondered if she knew that Lena had kept her promise to protect Mara, had found a way to keep them together against all odds. Holt came out and sat beside her, a blanket draped over his shoulders that he shared with her. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds, the wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl, the creak of the porch boards settling. "You know what I realized today?" Lena said. "What's that?" "That home isn't a place, it's people. It's feeling safe. It's knowing someone will fight for you when things get hard." Holt nodded. "That's the truth of it. Thank you for giving us that, for being that. Thank you for trusting me enough to stay." They sat together under the stars, and somewhere in the darkness, the future waited. Uncertain, but no longer frightening, full of possibilities instead of just dangers. Lena thought about school and teaching and all the things she might become. She thought about Mara growing up here, learning to read and ride and be strong. She thought about Holt, no longer alone, no longer just surviving, but actually living. And she thought about the auction block in Red Hollow, about the moment when everything could have gone differently, when they could have been separated and lost to each other forever. But instead, a quiet man had stepped forward and paid $50 in silver and changed the course of 3 lives. Inside the house, Mara stirred in her sleep and called out softly. Lena started to rise, but Holt gestured for her to stay. "I've got her," he said. He went inside, and through the window, Lena could see him bending over Mara's bed, smoothing her hair, murmuring something that made her settle back into sleep. When he returned to the porch, there was something different in his expression, a softness that hadn't been there before, a peace that came from knowing he'd done right by these 2 girls who'd been sold like livestock and had somehow found their way home. Spring came in earnest after that, turning the hills green and filling the air with the smell of sage and wildflowers. The ranch came alive with new growth, colts born in the pasture, chicks hatching in the coop, vegetables sprouting in the garden. Miss Warren continued her visits, and Lena's education progressed. She read everything she could get her hands on, dreaming of the day when she might teach others the way Miss Warren taught her. Mara grew tall and confident, her laughter ringing out across the ranch, as she chased butterflies and climbed trees and became the child she should have been all along. And Holt worked the land with a purpose he hadn't had in years, building not just for survival, but for a future that included these 2 girls who called him Papa and had made his house a home. On a warm May evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sun set, Mara looked up at Holt with serious eyes. "Papa, will we always be together?" Holt pulled her close, his voice firm with certainty. "Always. That's a promise. What if something bad happens? Then we'll face it together. That's what families do." Mara seemed satisfied with that answer. She settled against his side, her wooden doll clutched in one hand, and watched the sky turn gold and pink and deep purple. Lena sat on the steps, her schoolbook open in her lap, and felt the weight of everything they'd survived and everything they'd become. The auction block was far behind them now, a memory that grew fainter with each passing day, replaced by new memories of work and laughter and quiet moments of belonging. They'd been unwanted once, sold like property, nearly torn apart by a system that saw them as problems to be solved. But they'd found something rare in this hard country, a man who'd looked at 2 frightened girls and seen not a burden, but a chance to do something good. And in return, they'd given him back a piece of himself he thought he'd lost forever. The stars began to appear one by one, pinpricks of light in the gathering darkness. A cool breeze came down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of another day. Inside the house, the fire burned low in the hearth, casting warm light through the windows. And on the porch of a small ranch in the Montana Territory, a family sat together, not bound by blood, but by something stronger, something that had been forged in fear and hardship and had emerged as love. Lena looked at Holt, this man who had become her father in every way that mattered, and at Mara, safe and happy and whole. She thought about the long road that had brought them here, about all the moments when things could have gone wrong but somehow went right. And she understood that this was what home felt like. Not perfection, not certainty, but the simple knowledge that you were wanted, that you belonged, that someone would stand between you and the world when it tried to hurt you. "Tell us a story, Papa," Mara said, her voice drowsy with approaching sleep. Holt smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "What kind of story?" "A happy one." "All right then." He settled back against the porch post, Mara in his arms, Lena leaning against his shoulder. Once upon a time, in a dusty town called Red Hollow, two brave sisters stood on an auction block and refused to be separated. And a man who'd forgotten how to hope saw them and remembered what it meant to fight for something that mattered. And together, they built a home where there had only been loneliness and a family where there had only been loss. And they lived not happily ever after, because life doesn't work that way, but contentedly and bravely and together, which turned out to be even better. Mara's eyes drifted closed, a smile on her lips. Lena watched the stars and listened to the steady beat of Holt's heart beneath her ear. And in the quiet of that May evening, with the world vast and mysterious around them, but this small corner of it finally, blessedly safe, she let herself believe in the story he'd just told, not as fiction, but as the truth of their lives. The auction block was behind them. The fear was behind them. What lay ahead was uncertain, but it was theirs to face together. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.